So Florida has a lot more than just an invasive reptile problem. Florida is also now home to over 20 different species of invasive parrot, ranging from the tiny budginger to the massive blue and gold macaw. And the story behind all of these different species of birds, from how they got to Florida to the impacts that they are having throughout the entire state on its native wildlife and residents, is all incredibly interesting. So let's fly right into all the mysteries and the incredibly interesting story that surrounds Florida's parrot problem. So unlike most of Florida's other invasive wildlife species, the psittacians, aka the parrots, are just as much loved as they are hated. On one hand, they are incredibly noisy, happen to chew through electrical wire, and steal the homes of other birds. But in turn, they also fill a very important ecological niche once filled up by a now extinct species of parrot, the Carolina parakeet, which went extinct in 1904 due to overhunting. Unfortunately, as of now, there's no way we could bring this bird species back, but at least some of Florida's new species, such as the nade parakeet, can fill in the same ecological niche as the Carolina parakeet once did, as they aid in the process of seed and nut dispersal, and they also act as a really good food source for a variety of much larger predatory birds, such as falcons. That's not the only good though these birds do. A lot of people go out of their way to travel all the way down to South Florida, especially Miami, just to see these incredibly unique birds, as Miami alone is home to over 16 different species of parrot, parakeet, and macaw. Unfortunately, the vast majority of these birds came from some not so humble beginnings, with the vast majority of them being trafficked or poached from South America and being shipped all the way to the US to be sold either into the pet trade or the feather trade. This would lead to a multitude of different parrot populations becoming established all across the United States, but Florida stood out among the rest as having by far the largest number and highest level of diversity of invasive parrot species, in large part due to its warm climate, making it perfectly ideal for all of these parrot species to survive in addition to Florida's booming exotic pet trade during the second half of the 1900s. And for a multitude of different reasons, a lot of people simply wanted these parrots to be roaming wild throughout Florida, either for ecotourism or just to add some extra scenery to the city. This would lead to Miami eventually having over 16 different species of parrot, some of which were released by pet owners, and others were zoo escapes, and some were pretty much everything in between. Overall though, now Florida, especially the southeast, is now overran by all sorts of different parrot species, with Florida having by far the most diversity of different parrot species anywhere outside of Latin America. For this reason, a lot of people actually advocate for keeping the parrots around, and in some cities they're actually protected. This is because a lot of people consider the parrots, especially the rarer ones, such as the blue and gold macaw and the Amazonian parrot, as now being a part of Florida's culture and its Latino heritage, especially in the bigger cities such as Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Fort Myers, and West Palm Beach, where a lot of people say the parrots add to the tropical feel of each of these respective cities. Also, some of these parrot species are just adorable. Like, how could you want to remove this face? Still, a lot of people do consider the parrots nuisances due to their incredibly loud calls and their habit of chewing on electrical wire and making nests in some not so convenient places, especially the Quaker parrots, which happen to swarm in large numbers and to make nests all over the place, including telephone poles, houses, and even just people's trees in their backyards. A lot of people also think it's incredibly hypocritical that we choose to remove other invasive species, such as most of Florida's reptiles and fish, but we choose to keep all the invasive birds around, such as the Muscovy ducks, Egyptian geese, and the many different parrots that are now being found all across South Florida. And despite what a lot of people say, calling these parrots simply exotic and not invasive, a lot of these parrot species do still have a harmful impact on the native environment. A great example of this is how nade and blue-crowned parakeets have a habit of stealing the homes of woodpeckers in order to create their nest and seek shelter during rainy storms and when it gets too hot or cold. Not just is this incredibly bad for the woodpeckers, which depend on their holes in order to survive, this is also really bad for other bird species, such as the screech owl, which also happen to compete with the parakeets for these holes in order to survive. And as mentioned in my previous video, invasive species seem to have a very bad habit of carrying diseases with them when they are introduced to a new ecosystem. The same thing applies to these parrots, and while they haven't started a bird pandemic yet, they do still spread a lot of harmful diseases to a lot of Florida's native birds. Still, despite everything, a lot of people, even other scientists and birders beyond myself, still insist on protecting these birds, particularly from poachers, which in recent years have increased in numbers and are currently primarily trying to capture these parrots and reintroduce them back into the pet trade, unfortunately by using some not so ethical means. And just as unfortunately, a lot of these parrots that do end up going back into captivity aren't exactly in the best of care. If you didn't know already, parrots are one of the smartest groups of animals on Earth, and they also tend to be very social, and in some cases demanding as well. And for this reason, a lot of homes simply aren't capable of taking care of these parrots, and a lot of times these parrots just end up going back into captivity, only to be released back into the wild, or worse, abused and eventually pass away. And while it is better to take these parrots out of Florida's environment over their native ecosystems, you still have to think about these animals on an individual level. And unfortunately, the use of things such as sticky traps in order to capture these parrots is incredibly unethical. And unfortunately, this is happening more and more every year. And for anyone who's wondering, no, you cannot release these parrots back into the wild for one simple reason. That being the fact that they likely carry diseases from a lot of Florida's native bird species. So by having those diseases be released into the parrot's native ecosystems, it could cause a bird pandemic. Still, while I myself struggle to have a defined opinion on this, a lot of people still argue that these parrots should be removed from Florida's wilderness and that it is hypocritical that we choose to keep the feathered creatures around and not those that are scaly or even furry in some cases. Well, regardless of what happens, some of these parrot species seem like they're going to end up staying, such as the Quaker parrot, which is already established throughout South Florida, or even some of the larger species such as the blue and gold macaw, which are actually protected in Florida due to their iconic status as being a symbol of Miami, and also because they're still technically an endangered species in their native habitat. Some people have actually even gone as far as to arguing that Florida's native parrot populations could act as insurance colonies in case if they end up going extinct in their native range in the wild. And honestly, I'd love to hear all of your guys' opinions down below about this whole parrot crisis, as it is an incredibly controversial topic which I still don't have a defined stance on. Still, as of now, despite the pressures being put on them to be removed, it seems like most, if not all of these cetacean species are here in Florida to stay, with my personal favorite being the chestnut macaw, which I think is just absolutely adorable. But with so many different species, from the blue-crowned parakeet to occasional sightings of budgingers, there are so many different parrot species found throughout Florida, and I'd love to make a separate video covering them all. So if you enjoyed this video, then please feel free to like and subscribe so I can continue making more epic nature documentaries in the future. And if this video does well enough, I'll make a part 2 really soon. But in the meantime, have a nice day.